What is it that drives a human being to commit the most unspeakable acts? What happens in the mind when the normal brakes on violence fail? It's a question that takes us deep into the darkest territory of human psychology, to explore the very architecture of a killer.
This leads us to the age-old question, doesn't it? Is a killer's path set from birth, wired into their biology? Or is it something that's shaped by life, by trauma, by experience? Well, as we're about to see, the answer is a whole lot more complicated than one or the other.
So before we go any further, let's establish a baseline. We need a clinical foundation, and for that we turn to the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit. Now pay close attention to two key phrases here: cooling off intervals and psychological gratification. This tells us we're not talking about random acts of violence. This is a patterned behavior, driven by something deep inside.
To really understand the what, we have to start with the why. We have to examine the mind. So, our investigation begins with the core psychological traits that forensic experts see again and again.
You see, these traits don't exist in a vacuum. They build on each other to form this dangerous psychological armor. The lack of empathy makes cruelty possible. Psychopathy and narcissism provide the twisted justification for it. And what's truly disturbing is how this entire profile is often hidden behind a mask of charm, making these individuals masters of deception.
And this right here, this explains how they do it. It gets to the heart of that lack of empathy. When another person stops being a human being in your mind and becomes just an object to be used, well, all the internal barriers to violence just crumble. There's no emotional restraint because there was never an emotional connection to begin with.
But a psychological profile this extreme doesn't just appear overnight. The seeds are often planted decades before the first crime is ever committed. In fact, investigators can frequently trace these patterns all the way back to the earliest, most formative years of a person's life.
Now, let's be clear. These factors are not excuses, but they are undeniable patterns. A childhood filled with abuse, neglect, and constant chaos can seriously disrupt a child's emotional and moral compass. It can normalize aggression and create these incredibly deep psychological wounds.
But here's a really critical distinction we have to make. Millions of people suffer through horrific trauma and never ever become violent. So trauma isn't the sole cause. It seems to be a powerful catalyst that interacts with pre-existing vulnerabilities. It's that dangerous cocktail of nature and nurture coming together.
So, from the psychological, we're now going to shift to the physiological. Thanks to modern neuroscience, we can actually look inside the brain itself for clues, revealing potential biological factors that might contribute to this kind of violent behavior.
Okay, think of the amygdala as your brain's internal alarm system. For some violent offenders, that system just isn't working right. A reduced ability to process fear doesn't just make them less afraid of consequences, it also makes it harder for them to recognize fear in other people, which, as you can imagine, just erodes empathy even further.
And if the amygdala is the alarm system, then the prefrontal cortex is like the brain's CEO. It's in charge of things like good judgment, decision-making, and impulse control. If there are deficits here, it's like the brakes on violent thoughts or immoral urges, they don't work like they should.
All right, so we've looked at the mind and the physical brain. Now we have to ask, how does all of that manifest on the outside? As FBI profilers often say, behavior reflects personality. So let's turn to those behavioral patterns now.
This is a classic FBI framework, and it's used to help investigators understand the offender's mind just by looking at the crime scene. An organized offender, for example, shows planning and control. They're often socially functional and very aware of evidence. On the flip side, a disorganized offender leaves behind a chaotic, impulsive scene that reflects a deep emotional instability.
And another thing we see is that the road to murder is almost never a straight line. It follows a clear pattern of escalation. It often starts with violent fantasies, which kind of build up and reinforce the desire. Then that might lead to minor offenses as they start to test boundaries. Over time, the violence gets more and more severe, and eventually, the attacks can become more frequent as those cooling-off periods get shorter.
So all of this, it brings us to the main point of our analysis today. You know that popular idea we see in movies of a seemingly normal person who just snaps? That sudden, unpredictable break from reality? Well, criminology tells a very, very different story.
The truth is that final, violent act isn't a beginning, it's an end.
It's the culmination of a long, slow, internal process. What looks like a sudden snap to the rest of the world is usually just the final, visible step in a hidden psychological marathon.
So if it's not a snap, what is it? Well, this progression here breaks it down. It starts with fantasy, where violent thoughts are rehearsed over and over until they become psychologically satisfying. That leads to desensitization, where the emotional shock of violence starts to fade. The final stage is a loss of control, when the fantasy finally crosses over into reality, usually when internal triggers and an external opportunity line up perfectly.
So, you see, the act itself is the moment a threshold is crossed, yes. But the path to that threshold was long, and it was paved with a destructive mix of psychology, biology, and life experience. It's not a sudden break. It's a final destination.
And all of this leaves us with a very difficult question. If the final act of violence is really the end of a long developmental journey, it forces us to reconsider everything we think we know about choice, control, and ultimately where accountability for these actions truly begins. Comment your thoughts on this video. Also, subscribe to us to see more videos like this in the future. See you in the next video.